it is my pleasure to welcome Bob Zimmerman to talk to us about rhododendrons. Bob began his love affair with rhodies about 40 years ago and started cultivating them on his kitchen stove, which no doubt he'll tell us about. He grows and has about 300 species rhododendrons at Chimacum Woods, which is his nursery on the Olympic Peninsula. And I know that I am going to come and see it really soon. You need to phone and make an appointment with Bob, and he will give us the phone number later. But Bob has been 5 times to China and once to Tibet. And I think today we'll see mostly China, but I do know that it was rugged conditions and leeches are involved. So with that ado and the knowledge that I love rhodies, welcome Bob, and I'm glad that you're here today to talk about your species rhodies. Rhododendrons.
Thank you very much, Janet. Appreciate the chance to share with you all my love of species rhododendrons. And I'm going to start by simply showing you a whole bunch of pictures of the plants. No flowers so far, but rhododendrons are native to the northern hemisphere around the globe, which means that there are rhododendrons in Siberia, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Turkey, Afghanistan, then on to Asia itself, China, Burma, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, and then we end up in the US, East Coast, West Coast. Alaska has some native rhodies. And these rhodies often don't look a bit like the plants that we grow in our gardens, which are all hybrids. So a species is simply a rhododendron that grows all on its own in the wild. No gardener, nobody planted it, nobody messed with it. It's just growing there. And it's pretty exciting because they are often the dominant shrub in many places, especially China and environs over there. But these plants have very distinct characteristics, and they're a great addition to your garden 12 months out of the year. You know, ordinarily, rhodies bloom in May. They last for a week or two, and then they're pretty much gone, and we don't really pay too much attention to the bush unless it's happened to turn ugly. And we forget about it until next spring. These are plants that draw interest year-round because their leaves, their trunks, the shape of them, all very distinctive. Some of them have what's known as indumentum on the underneath of the leaf, and it's kind of furry, fuzzy. Sometimes it seems like it's hairy, but lots of nice colors. Sometimes the indumentum is on the top as well. This is pseudochrysanthemum from Taiwan. And the real fun of this has been those trips as well. This is Mount Everest from about 35,000 feet. We flew out of Kathmandu, made about 3 or 4 circles to gain altitude, and then took off level and never descended because Tibet rose up to meet us. And it was the funniest feeling. We really didn't have any sense of descending. We just were suddenly on the ground. This is Principus growing in Tibet, but it grows in our gardens here just as well. Primulaflorum at about 14,000 feet. And one of the things that we are doing on these trips is looking for things that are either new or haven't been proven out yet. So there was a report that there was a rhododendron called Lanatoides with about 6 specimens in Scotland, but nobody really knew if it was for real or not. Maybe it was a hybrid. Where did it come from? The collector's notes just said the Rongchu Valley of Tibet, which is kind of like saying California. So we went off in search of it, and there we are. They were about 15 feet tall. We wandered around the trunks, climbed them occasionally to see up top, and we proved out that yes, indeed, Lanatoides is a true species with a large population growing on the side of a mountain at about 12,000 to 13,000 feet. We botanized a pass that hadn't been visited by Westerners before, as far as we know. You notice in the lower left, there's a little red flower showing. Those are all Forestii repens growing on that hillside. And the glaciers were busy moving. The avalanches were coming down. It was a pretty exciting day. Raining, and the temps were probably about 34 Fahrenheit. As we got up to the top, we found that little red flower growing again here in Snowmelt Stream. Ordinarily, you're instructed to have excellent drainage for this little alpine. It's really a difficult plant to grow, and here it is growing in the middle of a stream. But we found whole hillsides covered with that rhododendron. This is what it looks like close up. And these were our porters that carried us in. This was a 2 overnight stay. We worked halfway up toward the pass the first day, went up the second, came down, stayed overnight, and then left. These are also the porters that turned us into the Red Army, because if they hadn't, they would have been in trouble if it ever got known that they had helped Westerners climb the pass. While we were on top of the pass, half of our group had turned around at lunchtime because of those avalanches, and they'd gone back down to camp, only to be greeted by the Red Army that said, "You're all under arrest. Come with us." They beat up our Tibetan drivers, took their driver's licenses, and the group that had returned back to camp said, "Oh, wait a minute, you've only got half of us. You need to get the other half too. They're up at the top of the pass. Why don't you go get them as well?" The Red Army said, "No, that's too much work. Just show up at the barracks tomorrow, and we'll go from there." So we did. We showed up, and the Red Army general said, "Well, you're under arrest because you don't have permits for being here." And we said, "Oh, yes, we do have permits." He said, "Really? Let me see them." So we showed them to him, and he said, "Ah, here's the problem. Those permits were issued in Lhasa by his boss. This is not Lhasa, and we don't recognize those permits out here. So you're all under arrest, and now I'm going to arrest you because you're spies. I want your camera and your film. You're taking pictures of the undersides of our bridges because your satellites can't see under the bridges." What there was to see under the bridges, I have no idea. But at any rate, we said, "No, we're not going to give you our cameras and our film." And he said, "Okay." And at that point, I realized what this was all about. The Tibetan guide never did tell us how much he had to pay for the fine, and we had to leave the territory. Disappointing, but a kind of a necessary flexibility you've got to have on these trips, because you never know what you're going to run into next. Whole fields of rhododendrons, but these trips are really only a third botanical. They're also a third cultural, and a third political, and a third spiritual. So here's a combination of the spiritual, and we've already heard the political. This is a monastery that has been there for quite a while. The original buildings were pretty much bombed out by the Chinese invasion in the 50s, but there was one old monk and one young monk living at this monastery, and he was very happy. The older gentleman was very happy to show us around. And this is his kind of library. There's a woodblock cut in each drawer of a particular Buddhist scripture. And if you would like a copy of that scripture, he's happy to ink up his woodblock and print it for you. And you see those pieces of scripture pasted all over the countryside. Tibet is far and away the most spiritual, religious place I think I've ever seen. The Buddhism has just permeated the people to the very bone. The young monk was carving mani stones, again, Tibetan alphabet, and some Buddhist scriptures. And when I admired his handiwork, he promptly threw it on the ground and broke it into many pieces, I'm sure to remind me that all things are perishable. But the Tibetan influence throughout shows itself in kind of a renaissance. This is in Muley territory, which was originally Tibet, but has now been moved over to Sichuan so that the government can control it better. And still a very touchy area, difficult to get into, requires special permission. But they're making an effort to restore things. And here you can see some of the painting that they're busy working on. The prayer flags are all over, not just at the monastery, but all over the countryside. Really quite imposing. Now, rhodies are more than bushes. This is the tallest rhododendron I've ever seen. It is 110 feet tall, and the item on the left of your screen is its trunk. The man in the photo is Peter Cox, a very famous rhododendron person from Scotland and leader of this expedition. And we took our belts off and measured the diameter of that rhododendron trunk on the left. And when we got back to camp, somebody produced a meter stick and we calibrated our belts. And the guy doing the calculations punched away and said, oops, wait a minute, I made a mistake. Let me start over. No, this rhododendron is really 8 feet in diameter. It really was. There's absolutely no way to climb it, but just an incredibly impressive specimen. But when we went to Arunachal Pradesh in 2017, we found a rhodie that was 10 feet in diameter. This is Andy Navage from Blodell Reserve. I'm sure many of you know him as the head horticulturalist over there. And he and Arlen Hill from Keeping It Green Nursery in Stanwood and I have formed a triumvirate. We've got 3 trips under our belt and maybe another one coming up, who knows. At any rate, we got into the tree simply by climbing on those vines because there sure was no way to anchor yourself to the trunk. But this one was not nearly as tall. It was about 35 feet in height, and the diameter was of the foliage cover was probably in the neighborhood of like 50 feet or so. Just an amazing, amazing tree. You have to guess that this rhodie is probably 200-300 years old. Arunachal Pradesh was just an amazing place, Northeast India, right on the Tibetan border, and very much uninhabited, untouched, and just an incredible trip. We did about 60 to 80 miles in 13 days of trekking, went from 570 meters to 3,600 meters. When we got snowed out, rained out, the monsoon just would not quit, even though it was the end of October. And we had to go back the way we came instead of completing a circle. Rhodies are under a lot of pressure throughout Asia. Here's an illegal logging camp that had cleaned off the forest pretty well. And those were the tents and the shacks that the loggers were living in, many of which slid down the mountain in a landslide. A number of loggers were killed. And you can see that the absolute mess that's been left, because this is what it should have looked like had those loggers not gone through there and done that. There's very little virgin forest left in China, almost none. And some of it's been cut over like 300 years ago, but there's no replanting. And so the land has just come back and scrubbed stuff and doesn't look anything like this. Here's a very fragrant rhododendron. This is Nuttallii, growing in that temperate forest. There were whole hillsides that had little white dots all over the hillside, and it was always rhododendron Nuttallii blooming beautifully. So here are some of the flowers for those rhododendrons. Gongshanense is another plant that we proved out. This is an interesting challenge because it wants to bloom in January and put on its new growth then. So brought back seed and have grown a bunch of these, put some out in 2010, which was a very bad winter to do that. Put out 4, 2 died from the cold. 1 was hurt badly, but 1 was untouched. So hopefully Chimacum Woods will be able to introduce a version of Gongshanense that apparently has more cold hardiness. One of the benefits of growing from seed, which is the way these are all propagated, is that you get biodiversity and you find that plant that has a little more hardiness than brothers and sisters, and so can survive. Some of the rhododendrons are epiphytes. That is, they grow on trees. they're not taking anything from the tree, they're just using the tree as a perch. And Sincuense is one of those rhododendrons. You get whole hillsides of rhodies, but look at the far hillside. You can see how much that forest has been thinned, decimated. At one point, that would have been covered solidly, and this is what's come back after goodness knows how many years. Erasilem's one of those fun plants because the flowers open pink, turn yellow, fade to white. And since all the buds don't open at the same time, you may very well have 3 different colored flowers on one plant at the same time. These are some of the plants growing up on the top of that pass. And here again is one of those that just wants to be a tree. There's whole forests of Hylaeum, smooth gray trunks, really hard to climb. It's like trying to climb a flagpole. And occasionally we get involved in a few other adventures. For $1.25, you got a round trip across the Dulong River, which is one of the last untamed rivers in Asia. And it's worth about 8 Mississippis. There are standing 8 to 10 foot waves as this monster body of water roars down the countryside over the rocks. And there was a rice paddy field on the other side of the river, and they'd set up these zip lines to get across. So sure enough, they were happy to, for the $1.25, they were happy to take us across, bring us back. This was a spot where there was a bit of pasture, the horses grazing among the rhododendrons, and there were some very nice basilicums on the other side of this pasture. We collected some seed. Several years later, we sent people back to collect some more seed, and they reported that the basilicum were gone. They found the stumps, and the pasture had been enlarged. So that's the kind of thing that we're really dedicated to trying to at least preserve. For a while, we had to deal with Kunming Institute of Botany, where they helped us take seed, and we agreed that when they got their national parks established and protected, that they would come back to us for cuttings and for seed. And unfortunately, that's really never happened, because in the meantime, China has become more and more restrictive about what's allowed and what's not, and they have no way of being a part of that anymore. We also got into an area that had never been botanized by Westerners before, into the Dulong River. This is on the border between the Salween and the Irrawaddy River. Over the pass, the stuff to the east drains into the Salween. The stuff to the west goes into the Irrawaddy. And they had just carved a new road. You can see it snaking around the mountains. That's our road. And incredible, because it was still getting closed by landslides. But we worked our way into Dulong territory. These are all tribal people, minorities, and it's an amazing confluence of ancient tribal customs up against the 20th and 21st century. They all have TVs. It gets exciting sometimes. We all managed to make it across. And the pony man said, nope, can't bring the pony. So we hired the villagers to carry our stuff. But by nightfall, when Pony Man was getting a little hungry, he managed to get the horses across and join us for dinner. Nice timing. Now, leeches have gotten mentioned. Down low especially, the leeches are pretty sneaky. And we often spend de-leeching time. If it's bad, it's about every 10 minutes we make a daisy chain, and everybody de-leeches the person in front of them. And Don forgot to check his top of his boots and his socks, and paid the price. Leeches really aren't bad. Their damage looks way worse than anything else. They use an anticoagulant, so you bleed a fair amount, but they don't transmit diseases, so it's not a health hazard. One of the reasons people were interested in the Dulong area was because the Dulongs had a somewhat distinctive way of protecting their young girls. The Dulong people are fairly small, and they were always at the mercy of the Tibetans, and I suppose the Han Chinese too. The people were the traders between Tibet and China. They'd carry stuff across the mountains, but the Tibetans would come in, raid the villages, and take the young girls. So in order to put a stop to that, the young girls got tattooed at about age 13. With the revolution, that got stopped, but a few of the elderly women still bore the mark of tattooing. This is one of my favorite pictures because here's the grandma with her grandkids, and the boys were hanging all over her. It's obvious that they're very attached to her, and nothing different about grandma. It's the way grandma's always been. A little monanthem growing off the rock. China is an interesting place. This is the smog in Chengdu. When we arrived, we thought, oh, we'll be able to get out of that once we get into the countryside. Within a half hour, our eyes were burning. You could feel it in your lungs. We had to get up to about 3,000 meters before we got out of that smog. And we were, at that point, 125 miles away from Chengdu. It really is just unbelievable. The Chinese freeways are always flat. You cross over any valley on the pylons, you might be 1,000 feet above that valley. And then when you come to the mountain on the other side, you drill a tunnel through the mountain and continue flat and then span over the next valley. And this just goes on for miles and miles. And you can sail along at 90 to 100, 110 kilometers an hour with absolutely no problems. When you want to come to an interchange, however, there is suddenly a problem because the valley is 1,000 feet below. So the interchange gets incredibly complex, and whole mountains get bulldozed, moved, rearranged in order to make that interchange work. And again, the roadies are just collateral damage. One of the monks from the monasteries, notice the cell phone, notice the Nike swoosh. These guys go home at night to their girlfriends, their mistresses, their wives, whomever, and they're back being a monk the next day. There are some efforts to preserve some of the roadies in the national parks. This is a spiroblastum that's probably, again, at least a couple hundred years old. But notice how they've paved the walkways. They want very much to make these accessible. They're trying very hard to get the Chinese interested in tourism. Visiting the Wild West is a highlight of an Eastern Han Chinese person's life, I think. Problem is they don't really know what it is they're supposed to see or why they're going there, but the government tells them it's a good thing to do. And they come out dressed in high heels and fancy clothes, and the Chinese try to make it accessible with these crazy pavements. They also like to do little reflecting ponds in order to make the plant, I guess, more gorgeous. Of course, the problem is that you end up causing great problems for the plant. This plant is doomed because the roots on the high side are paved over with the walkway. The roots on the low side are underwater now because they've dammed that little stream to make the reflecting pond. And I guarantee you that within 10 or 20 years, this rhodie will be dead. Another thing they've done to introduce tourism is take these minority people. They really want them in the city. So they came to the Miao village and they said, okay, 2/3 of you are going to have to go to the city, and the other third of you can stay in the village, but you're going to have to greet the tourists. Well, we managed to arrange an overnight trip, which is not always easily done. And we set out, we picked up our provisions at the at the Miao market. Now, these ladies all have the same vegetables. I don't know if this is a cooperative or if you pick a certain ladies' fruits and vegetables. Never did quite get an answer to that. But at any rate, they are there. And that's our Chinese host in the background paying the bill for the provisions. And off we went, camped overnight, and came out on the other side at the new Meow Village. This is like Frontierland in Disneyland. This is all phony. It's all brand new construction. You can take a tour of the courthouse or the post office or the printery. And those are all Han Chinese people in the picture. There are no Meow people in that picture. The third that got to stay behind are all inside manning the souvenir counters and all the other phony things that are going on. In the meantime, the other 2/3 of the village are here in the city. When you come in, you don't get a residency card. That means that you're not entitled to any health care, and your kids can't go to the local schools. So the kids go back to the Meow Village to be with the grandparents, who are the ones that are left there. And they really have a pretty bleak future. There's not much opportunity for these folk. Some of the other aspects of these rhodies are those trunks. So here's a Barbadum growing in our garden at Chimacum Woods. And as you can see, it has a very beautiful trunk, nice red like a madrona. This thing blooms a bright red early in March, late February. There's some of that Lanatoides that we proved out in Tibet, raised from seed here at Chimacum Woods. More of that great foliage. And the hairs, those hairs are soft, they're not prickly tall. And the red things are leaf bracts. They kind of protect the stem as it's growing. They will fall off with time. And in the meantime, you have this sort of tree-like plant that's just growing beautifully. The new growth on some forms of erosum. More of that Gongshanense. Lots of different features to these plants. Sariense is a plant that comes from Tibet, has nothing to do with Russian emperors of old. There's a Tsari Valley. And the funny thing is that we've never been able to find it in the Tsari Valley, but we have found it in Arunachal Pradesh, in Sikkim. It's a plant that still could use some more exploration. Those are simply going to be, those are leaf buds. They're going to be new stems and new branches. They're not flowers. There's a whole group of deciduous Japanese azaleas that we really don't give enough honor to. They are wonderful plants with, some of them have two different leaf shapes on them. They first come out with a kind of rhomboid leaf, and then the second set of leaves looks more like an ordinary azalea. But some of them have really lovely fall color. That smooth trunk hylaeum that we saw earlier, one of the Chinese botanists was kind enough to climb it for me. And the problem, of course, is that the seed is out at the end of the branch. So Mr. Wang was being encouraged to go just a little further, just a little further. Don't worry, we'll tell your wife how you died. At any rate, he broke the branch off and threw it on the ground. And the leader said, "Oh, there went your seed, Bob." But I managed to get 6 seeds and grow 6 plants. William Z. Ainham's new growth comes out this bronzy orange color, fades to green. Nice, makes a wonderful little mound about 3 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and takes a lot of sun. Magnaflorum is a new introduction, probably extinct in China at this point. It's in the way of agribusiness and has probably been bulldozed into oblivion at this point. There's only one collection of it that we know of. And it began to bloom for most of us this year. And we had collected that in 2009. So it took 11 years to bloom, worth the wait. Cicatense is one that comes from Siberia. It's sort of semi-deciduous. The yellow leaves are going to fall off. The leaves that are going to stay, the green ones up top, are starting to turn maroon. They'll be maroon all winter. Next spring, they'll turn back to green, and then be the ones that will turn yellow that fall and fall off. One of those Japanese azaleas, quinquefolium. Nice little red margins on the leaves, small white flowers, makes a wonderful container plant. This is a kind of protective waxy coating that grows on the top of the leaves. It will slowly flake off in the course of the season, but it just gives a stunning effect to the plant as it's putting on its new growth. The new growth turns out to be more fun than the flowers in lots of cases. Pachysanthem from Taiwan keeps this frosty, bronzy look all year round. And there's still lots to be explored, lots to see throughout. We keep finding new species of rhododendrons. It's always amazing. Every year there's 3 or 4 new ones that have been found somewhere in that northern hemisphere that for some reason have never been talked about before. And so here at Chimacum Woods, we try and preserve some of that, the gene bank, and try and make these rhododendrons more available for your garden. We have about 9 acres planted out in a display garden. You're certainly welcome to come and visit anytime you would like. You can reach us either at the phone number there or at our website. Our website has about 100 and some odd pages devoted, 1 page per plant, where you can look at all the different species that we either have or have grown at one time. But I think there's a lot of information there. And if nothing else, it makes good bedtime reading. So that's what we have to say there. Do you have some questions at this point?
May I start by asking a question? Are there any wild rhodies near here? In the spring, I've been at Mount Walker and seen, well, late May, these pale pink rhodies. Are they wild rhodies?
They are indeed. That rhododendron is Rhododendron macrophyllum, and it is the state flower of Washington. And it runs from southern BC all the way down through south of the Bay Area, where it pretty much stops. But there are large stands of it in Kitsap County. If you drive along Highway 3 from Paulsbo to Silverdale, you will often see them blooming in the spring in the woods. And mostly it's pink, but there are some darker forms. And then there's an occasional white form as well. There's another rhododendron native to Washington, and that's Albaflorum. And you can see that quite easily. If you drive up to Hurricane Ridge, go past the visitor center toward the picnic areas and stop at that first parking lot, the Albaflorum is probably growing over the hood of your car by the time you park. It's a little white. It's very difficult to grow down at sea level. I think if you really want to grow it at sea level, you have to cover it in snow in September and keep it covered until June of the following year. And then I think it probably would do fine once you thaw it out. But that's not real practical for most home gardeners.
Yeah.
Then there's a third one on the West Coast, and it doesn't grow in Washington, but it does grow Oregon and California. It's a deciduous azalea called Occidentale. Basically white with lots of pinks and yellows and greens splashed around the flower. And it is incredibly fragrant and well worth growing just because of that marvelous fragrance. So that's kind of the extent of West Coast rhododendrons. The East Coast has 3 evergreen rhodies plus about 13 deciduous azaleas that range from Nova Scotia down to Florida. And the Blue Ridge Parkway is a great spot to see a wide variety of those. And some of them are just incredibly blazing oranges, reds, yellows. get some great fall foliage out of some of them. Most of them have fragrance. That's really another wonderful class of plants. And those grow very well in our gardens here. They're happy to be West Coasters.
I've always thought rhododendrons take a long while to grow, and you talked about one rhododendron taking 11 years before it flowers. Is that normal to take that long?
Yes and no. The species tend not to put on the tremendous floral show that the hybrids do. Remember, the hybrids were bred for flowers. So nobody cared what the plant looked like. You just cared what the flower looked like. And hybridizers kept putting the red on the yellow and seeing if they couldn't get orange. And for a while, it was the gaudier the better. I always figured they'd come up with one that glowed in the dark. But and those will bloom more readily because of a thing called hybrid vigor. But of course, they don't look like much the rest of the year for the most part because they weren't bred for plant habit. They were bred for flower. And the reason that they all bloom in May is because that's when the trust shows were. So the rhododendron clubs would put on a flower show. There used to be one on Bainbridge that was a big deal every year. We'd move from place to place. We had different venues for it, but there'd be 300, 400, 500 trusses of flowers that people would bring in. And then the impartial judges would go around and pick the, quote, best one. That would get a blue ribbon. If you did that in England, you'd likely get real silver for it. But at any rate, everybody would say, oh, what a great rhododendron. Well, what a great flower. But the plant may be one of those things that gets spindly and leggy and quite awkward and what have you. The species, on the other hand, produce less flowers, but have year-round interest. They just don't, a lot of them just don't look like rhodies. My favorite question from a customer is, that's a rhododendron? And the answer is yes, it is. Some hybridizers have begun to weave some of those plants into the more modern hybrids, but the species themselves are really worth growing. And it's always, I think, a great connection to Mother Nature and the diversity of what Mother Nature can come up with. Because rhododendrons start subtropical and go all the way to alpine. So the speciation that's happened over that range of growing conditions just gives you plants that are so diverse from one another. Leaf size ranges from no more than 1/4 of an inch to almost 3 feet and anything in between. Height varies from maybe a maximum of 12 inches tall up to goodness knows, 20 feet if you wait long enough. And rhodies don't really stop growing. They don't reach a certain height and then stop. The trade has always said height in 10 years, but what they don't tell you is height in 20 years. And so especially those old hybrids, they're going to just keep going. And pretty soon they've covered all the windows, or all you're looking at is trunks. And that's sort of how rhodies have gotten a bad name. But that doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be that way. If you need something very low growing, there's a species that will fill the bill for you.
Oh, thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
When we moved here about 40 years ago, we ran into Howard Short, and I'm sure you know Howard, and he gave us an education. He gave us our first class on the rhododendron farm that he had here on Bainbridge Island, and it was just interesting that we bought several plants from him, which are long gone because we've sold the house, but it was very, very interesting, and I'm sure you know him, Robert.
Oh yeah.
So I just wanted to say a little hello to Howard. I think probably Howard has probably passed away by now.
Oh yes, yes indeed. But he was kind of a pioneer. He worked hard at getting species. The species were really hard to come by back in the 60s and 70s, because remember, China was closed. So, and most of the seed from the explorers' turn of last century had gone to the Brits. And they had very carefully grown that seed under the collector's numbers, put it out in their garden, allowed them to self-sow after openly pollinating, and then put the collector's numbers on the kids. And that is, of course, a big no-no, because you didn't know who dad was. And all they did was have a bunch of hybrids, because when you put a Thompsoni next to a Calophytum in your garden, sure enough, the bee is going to carry pollen from one to the other, and now you have a Thompsoni Calophytum hybrid. But they, of course, either called it Thompsoni or Calophytum, whichever collector's number they happened to put on that seedling. And so in the 50s, 60s, 70s, you could have 3 Rexes in your garden, no 2 of which looked alike, and no 1 of which was Rex. They were all Rex hybrids. So when China opened up in '81, it was almost like starting over. And so it's been exciting to be part of the seed gathering process since then.
Well, I appreciate your talk today. Rhodies are very fascinating, and your presentation was fantastic.
Yes, it was. Yeah. It was really good. Has anyone else another question?
I may be asking a question that was already asked, but you were talking a lot about saving and preserving Rhodies. Are there Rhodies that are invasive anywhere?
For the most part, no, with one major exception. In England, the lords planted a lot of a particular hybrid on their estates for cover for birds, and they did it for the grouse and pheasant hunting. It was a ponticum hybrid that unfortunately comes from the roots, and you've got it on the loose all over Scotland. If you've been to Scotland in the spring, you've seen whole hillsides with this purple flower covering it. It's very pretty, but you can't get rid of it. And yeah, that's really been disaster there. Here, that's never happened in the U.S. and it won't. It's sometimes species can be more challenging to grow than invasive.
Bob, can you tell us the name of the Scottish Rhodie again? Because we got a blip in the internet right at that very point in your conversation.
Okay. The species is, they call it ponticum, but it's really a ponticum hybrid.
Okay.
Nobody knows who dad was. But that's, you have to get all the root out if you want to eradicate it. And it's just driving them nuts, giving Rhodies a very bad name over there. But that's the only time that's ever happened. And again, it's hybridizers messing around with Mother Nature. I've got straight ponticum in the garden. It gets large, but it's not, I wouldn't call it invasive. It's not going anywhere. Partly, the other piece of this is that Rhodies can walk, because when a branch hits the ground and lays there for a while, it will root. And so all of a sudden, you've really got a new Rhodie started. And if it gets enough roots, you can cut that limb off from the mother plant and you can dig it up and move it elsewhere. So in that sense, they may cover ground, and some of the hybrids, again, will do that. But they're easily enough controlled, and they're certainly not going to get loose and take over the world and displace the Douglas fir or anything like that.
Well, thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
Yes, Robert, how are the azaleas and the Rhodies related?
Oh, good question. It turns out that all azaleas are rhododendrons, but not all rhododendrons are azaleas. Azaleas are supposedly noted for their 5 stamens, as opposed to rhododendrons, other rhododendrons that have 10 stamens. But there's enough exceptions, and that's not always true. You can do some genetic work, or you can give an azalea and a rhododendron to a deer, and the deer will most likely eat the azalea and turn his nose up at the rhododendron.
Okay.
Although, given the deer
Thank you.
population lately that's building up, I imagine people on Bainbridge are having their rhodies nibbled, and I would imagine, I know that people on Whidbey are having their rhododendrons eaten by the deer. Port Townsend is another just awful place to garden because there's absolutely no control of the deer. They not only take over the streets, they take over your garden. The next door neighbor feels compelled to feed them, and anything green is munchable if a deer is desperate enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Rhododendrons are like kale to people, at least some people. My wife just laughed. You know, whereas azaleas are more like a hot fudge sundae. So sort of.
Well, thank you. That was interesting. Yes, we do get a lot of deer. So does anyone else have a question? Bob, I wanted to say thank you to you. It was very informative, and I'm sure I can see why you love going on your trips to collect seeds, because you never quite know what you're going to find, and that's the joy of it.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. The trips are so full. They're really quite amazing, and mostly because people around the world are incredibly friendly. We have a great time. But the Arunachal Pradesh trip, we had 10 porters from the same village. The guys thought they were on vacation. They'd knock out the day's journey in a couple hours. Well, of course, we always stopped to botanize, but still, they could move 2-3 times faster than we could while they're carrying 100-pound packs, and we're got our little day pack on. But we all, slept in the same shelter. They kind of strict rules about eating. We would sort of eat together, but they ate different food than we did. But by the end of the 2 weeks, we could joke around, and a couple nights we had singing contests. They were singing some of their tribal songs, and then pretty soon they said to the three of us, "Okay, you got to sing." And Andy claimed he couldn't sing a note in his life, and Arlen decided that his voice was kind of hoarse right now. But I gave him a rendition of "Hey Jude," and they thought that was was great. And the next night, they did it again, and so I came up with "If I Had a Hammer." So. Not the greatest renditions of those songs that have ever been done, but they seemed satisfied with it. So
you ended up being a little political there with Pete Seeger lyrics.
Yeah, well, I think that was definitely a political statement. But see, again, these people are they're right on the Tibetan border, and they have relatives over in Tibet, and they will cross through the mountains and go visit and come back, and there's nobody around to stop them or say you can't do that. And they talk about the difference and how hard it is for their relatives over on the Tibetan side, and how the last thing in the world they want is to be part of China. China claims Arunachal Pradesh. They had a shooting war over it in the 60s, and they finally agreed on a truce line, the McMahon line. And to this day, China claims that territory. You actually heard 10 days before our trip, the Chinese decided they needed a parking lot on the border, and the Indians decided that was on their side of the border, and saner heads prevailed, and the Chinese didn't pursue the parking lot, but they're always pushing. So last 6 months or so, there's been that skirmish up at 14,000 feet over some land right on the border to the western end of Arunachal Pradesh. We were more in the eastern side. And the Indian Army is busy building roads up into the area. The Chinese already have the roads, and the roads are big enough that they could bring in some armaments. The Indians have a base at Tooting, which is where we our jumping off point for the trek. That is an airfield. The the Indians have never landed a jet on that airfield, but they do bring in helicopters, and they're very smart. They want to win the hearts and minds of the people, so that they will arrange medevacs for the indigenous folk that really need more serious medical treatment. If the rice harvest fails, they will distribute rice for free. We ended up eating a takin, which is a whole other story, of a very rare Himalayan goat cow kind of cross, very endangered species. But these people, it's like an elk has a bull and a harem. The bull was moving the harem down when we were there, and the porters tracked him, and one day they got him, and we all had fresh takin that night. They smoked the meat. They got about 100 kilos of meat that they smoked overnight. And the Indian Army, we had been sort of dancing with the Indian Army throughout the trip. They were on patrol up there, and a couple of the soldiers were used to help ferry the dried meat back to the village. So you're really in the thick of some interesting territory. It takes all kinds of permits to get in to do that. We had to fill out a 4-page questionnaire. One of the questions were any of your grandparents Pakistani? Thank goodness we could all say no. I don't know what happens if you say yes. But even the Indians, an Indian citizen needs a special permit to go into that area. And no Indian, if you weren't born there, can live there, work there, own land there. They're working so hard to keep this as pristine and as much a buffer against China as they can. But stay tuned. You know, China will push and see what they can get away with. It's just the Chinese way.